Mother, Book 4 of Stories for the Inner Child, by Steve Gallegos. Chapter 1, Joy. Mother had never intended to get married. It's not that she didn't want to get married. That is not what it was at all. She was just so in love with nature, with the sunshine and with the flowers and the birds, and with everything that grows. And she had never really given any thought to having children. She was very content at home, where she lived with her 2 older sisters and a younger brother, Daniel. Her 2 sisters were quite a bit older than she was. Maria was 8 and Elena was 7 years old when she was born. So life had come to a gentle and regular rhythm in her parents' family life when she suddenly appeared. And then, only a year later, Daniel arrived. Whereas she had been the picture of health, robust, happy, and she learned very rapidly, Daniel was somewhat the opposite. But since he was the first boy, his older sisters and his mother and father doted on him. Daniel had taken this special attention to heart and thought that he was actually quite handsome and special, and his specialness was only that he was a boy in a family of girls. But his father had doted on him, at least when he was young. His father had always wanted a boy, someone to continue the family name, and someone who could learn to play ball and go hunting. Daniel's father was not the brightest flower in the field, but then neither was Daniel. The 3 girls had all begun talking quite early in their lives, but Daniel said almost nothing until he was 3 years old. But since he was so special, being the only boy in a family of 3 girls, there had really been no need for him to say very much. His 2 oldest sisters played with him as if he were a doll, dressed him, fed him, told him stories, and tended him as if he really were something special. So, still unable to tend much for herself when Daniel was born, Mother naturally felt as if there were neither enough attention nor love for her. And from this early age she began to withdraw into herself, to make room for all that was being directed toward Daniel. She didn't reject Daniel. It was just that whenever attention or care were being given, she presumed it was aimed at Daniel and not at her. She made no assumption that she was anything special, for it was always Daniel that was, and this was the natural state of affairs. We could say that this was the world as she got to know it growing up. This young girl had curiously been given the name Joy. I say curiously because after she was 1 year old, there was never any joy in that family around her existence. Chapter 2, Ted. Joy had grown up doing what others needed for her to do, and seldom thinking about her own needs. In fact, she was seldom noticed in that family. She found that doing what others needed for her to do gained for her the greatest amount of attention and caring, even though that was not very much. But in her own way, she was content. And having learned to read quite early in her life, in fact, before she ever went to school, she would occupy herself with books and stories and lived her own life in kind of a fantasy way, daydreaming that she gained acclaim by being the respected servant in a royal household, or by being the best friend of the most popular kid in school, or saving someone but quickly stepping back out of the limelight. These daydreams kept her preoccupied, so that she seldom noticed how very seldom she was the focus of anyone else's attention. And if she did begin to have the slightest feeling of longing or loneliness, she quickly found herself rescued by her readily available fantasy world. In fact, her daydreaming became the place where she spent most of her time. The people around her considered her slightly unfocused or distant, unless they needed her to do something, in which case she was immediately present to serve their needs. But then she would slip quickly but quietly back into her daydreams and away from their attention. Being the focus of awareness was something that almost terrified her. Yet deep within there was also a deep longing to be recognized and needed, and there seemed to be no place of balance between these two states of need. Her only place of seeming balance was to retreat into her books or her fantasies. This, however, was not a place of balance, but of safety. In high school she fell in love over and over again with various boys, but always from a distance and in secret, so that they never knew, and if she was close to one of them or felt his interest in her, she would quickly scurry away as fast as she could. There was a constant agitation in her of seeming withdrawal and almost frantic longing, of inability to act from her earnest desire, but also of terror that she would. What she evinced on the surface was a compulsive shyness and also a deep, almost foreboding curiosity. When she finally graduated from high school, she was terrified of entering the world of adults, for she did not feel grown up. She constantly looked for cues from others as to how she should act, what she should do, how she should dress and look. She was very aware of others' attention on her, yet this was also her greatest source of discomfort. And then she met Ted. She wasn't actually in love with Ted, but he gave her just the amount of space she needed, not questioning too much, never demanding or insistent, yet able to take charge and decide for both of them, and at the same time maintaining a type of sophisticated reserve. She continued to live in her fantasy land, but with his inclusion, and imagined them married with children and living a life of comfort and safety, where he could make the decisions, but always with her input and acquiescence. So this romance, if it could be called such, continued in this almost unobtrusive manner, meeting Ted on occasion and talking about not much at all, but with Joy feeling accepted and in relationship, although to an external observer it did not look at all like much of a relationship, for not much actually happened in it. Her family, not so much her parents but her two older sisters and brother, thought of her relationship with Ted as a casual, almost distant friendship, until Joy announced shyly one day that Ted had asked her to marry him. Chapter 3. Baby. The wedding was held, just a small family affair, for neither Ted nor Joy had any close friends. They moved into a small apartment and immediately began saving to buy a house. Their relationship as a married couple did not change very much from what it had been before they got married, other than sleeping with each other legally and finding small things to do together, going to the movies on Saturdays, eating out at a small restaurant once every 2 weeks, and watching television almost every evening. Ted began to follow the news, especially anything that was of a political or a startling nature. And Joy began to learn how to cook and took a casual interest in shows that involved food preparation. They soon had little to say to one another, Ted repeating some of the news that he had seen or heard about at work, and Joy talking about food and new ways of preparation that she had seen on TV. Life progressed, or at least seemed to, until Joy began missing her periods, but this was something she had difficulty telling Ted, until she was certain and herself felt the small developing bundle in her belly. She was not sure she wanted a child or another person present in the somewhat easy relationship that she and Ted had come to, a presence with each other where there was neither change nor threat. To have another being around who could possibly comment on the relative emptiness of their lives, something that both Joy and Ted were careful to avoid, seemed risky. Besides, she felt that a baby being in the house would require what little awareness she received from Ted to be redirected toward the baby. But at the same time, there was something curious happening in her own mind. Certain understandings or realizations that had never been present before, a sense of motherhood that was warmly tangible, and the movement and growth in her belly had a certain tingle to it, a wealth of feelings that she was growing into, a sense of connection with her own mother that she had never really known. And she also felt closer to Ted than she ever had before. And so, one evening, during dinner and before TV, she looked Ted deeply in the eye and said, "We are growing bigger." Ted initially took it to mean that he was gaining weight, which in fact he already knew, and began to feel upset that it was so noticeable as to be commented on. But there was a subtle smile on Joy's face that he found quixotic, and so he opened one eye wider and looked more deeply at his wife. He felt a shudder, and then suddenly understood her meaning. "You mean we're having a baby?" "Yes, dear, in about 6 months from now." Chapter 4. No. Joy was uncomfortable going to doctors, but knew that it was time to begin making preparations so that the doctor would be available for the birth. She particularly did not like being prodded and poked by the doctor, even if a nurse was present. It was just too personal and private, so she had delayed the visit for as long as she practically could. And she certainly didn't like answering questions about her intimate experiences and the parts of her body that she had learned one did not speak to others about. So she had procrastinated and delayed and stumbled about in her trip to the doctor's office. But once at the door, she had put on a brave face and acted as if she was completely comfortable, although the conflict showed in every gesture. Dr. Gerard, however, was completely respectful of the need for female privacy, and was extremely delicate in the way he asked questions and made suggestions. After all, this was a small town, and he recognized the need for keeping his professional practice separate from his public presence. But he was unprepared for this. "No, no, no, no!" Joy was laying on the examination platform, and Dr. Gerard had just lifted the gown that the nurse had given Joy to put on. "No, no, please don't!" "Please relax, Mrs. White. This won't hurt a bit, and Nurse Prine is right here. You can hold her hand if you wish to." "No, no, please, please don't!" Joy was rigid with fear. "Please don't do it. Please don't touch me again." "But Mrs. White, I haven't touched you at all." "No, no, no more, please. I don't like it. I don't like it." She had turned white as a sheet and was rigid, blank-eyed, squeezing Nurse Prine's hand so tight that it hurt, and she would not let go. "Please let go. You're hurting me," Nurse Prine said. But Joy White was not even in the room, even though her body was, and it was clenched in terror. Chapter 5. Gone. The little girl was all alone. It was dark. She heard the door opening and the man entered. His breathing was heavy, fast, harsh. She tried to close her eyes as tightly as she could. She didn't want to see who it was. His footsteps were terrifying and heavily revolting. "No, no, go away." Her entire body shuddered and then went stiff. The sound of his soft voice went through her like an electric shock. "You'll like it, I know you will." Go away, don't come near me, go away, please." The soft footsteps came closer. A hand brushed against her face as it lifted the cover. She was clinging tightly, hoping to shield herself with the soft blanket. The breathing was faster. She could feel it on her small face. It was so warm against her frozen face. She shrieked and was gone. Chapter 6. Return. Mrs. White, Mrs. White. The doctor was standing over her, and Nurse Prine was holding her hand. Joy opened her eyes slowly and was overjoyed to see Dr. Gerard, but she was still badly shaken. What happened? You seemed terrified and then fainted. We were just about to call for an ambulance, but the smelling salts seem to have brought you back. I don't think we should continue with the examination today. Let's reschedule it for some later time. I'm concerned about your fainting, and you seemed to be hallucinating just before you did. Perhaps you should see a counselor before you return. Dr. Gerard was indeed worried. Yes, later. Joy's face was still blanched white, and her voice was shaking. The nurse helped her to her feet and helped her put her clothes back on, while Dr. Gerard went out to the receptionist and spoke quietly to her. As Joy left, still unsteady on her feet, the receptionist handed her a card with a name and phone number on it. Dr. Gerard suggested you call this number before you reschedule. Joy sat in her car for a long time. What was that? Why are my hands shaking? Why do I dread calling this number? Then she decided it was best not to think about it anymore and drove home. Chapter 7. Not Knowing. Joy spent the next few days in a daze. She had not told Ted that she would be going to the doctor, and she felt no need to tell him what had happened, even if she had known what had happened. It had to be kept a secret. She kept hearing herself say these words, but didn't understand why, nor did she question why. It would be best just to forget the whole thing. But she kept forgetting other things as well. She locked the keys in the car and had to ask Ted for help. Luckily, he had another set. She found herself inattentive at meals, forgetting to bring food to the table, but Ted seemed not to notice her spaciness. She soon forgot that she had even been to the doctor. She found a card in her pocket with a phone number on it and wondered what it was and where she had gotten it. But she didn't wonder for long. She put it in the wastebasket and forgot about it. Nurse Prine called several days later and asked how she was. Joy answered that she was fine and quickly hung up the phone. Then she wondered why the nurse had called, but she didn't wonder for long and quickly forgot that the call had even occurred. She wandered around in a bubble of protected oblivion. She was safe, but she didn't notice what she was safe from. Nor did she want to. Her greatest safety seemed to be in not knowing. Chapter 8. Suddenly. Days followed days and weeks followed weeks, and Joy was relaxed but forgetful. Her belly continued to grow, and she knew there was something she should do, but she never could quite grasp what it was. Ted seemed just as oblivious, as if he had joined with Joy in her not knowing and not wanting to know, and the two were happy together in a forgetful sort of way. And then one day Joy was at the kitchen sink, washing the breakfast dishes, when she felt some water running down her legs. Her first thought was that it had splashed out of the sink. Then she began to think that perhaps she had wet herself, and she turned and was making her way toward the bathroom when a sudden flash of pain woke her up. "Oh, my God, I'm having a baby!" She made her way to the telephone and was going to call Ted at work, but the pains were so sudden and jolting, and she knew there was no time to waste. She dialed the number for the hospital, which she found conveniently written on the cover of the phone book. Had she written it there herself? She didn't remember doing so, but yet it did look like her handwriting. By the time she had waddled to the living room, there was already a siren in the driveway, and someone was knocking loudly at the door. 2 orderlies helped her into the ambulance, and sirens wailing, they arrived at the emergency entrance to the hospital. Dr. Gerard looked strangely at Joy as she was ushered into the delivery room, and as he reached under her dress to examine her, she suddenly remembered and fainted. Chapter 9. Baby. Joy held a little baby in her arms. Ted was standing by her side. She was not sure how she had gotten to this place, but she smiled, looked at the tiny baby, and then at Ted, who was beaming. Dr. Gerard was standing nearby, looking concerned. "How do you feel, Mrs. White?" Startled by his words, Joy looked at the doctor and quickly smiled. "I feel fine. When can I go home?" We'd like for you to stay in the hospital a few more days. There's some tests we would like to run." "What kind of tests? Is everything okay? Is something wrong? What kind of tests?" Joy sounded shaken. "Just some normal tests to make sure everything is all right, since this is your first baby, and we'd like to give you some instruction on caring for the baby," Dr. Gerard answered. Joy looked quizzically at Ted, then at Dr. Gerard, but when she looked at the tiny baby, her gaze softened, and she smiled. "Certainly, whatever you think best, Doctor." Chapter 10. Ill. For some reason that she did not understand, Joy was afraid that Dr. Gerard might find out that she was not suitable as a mother. So during the next few days in the hospital, she showered her attention on the new baby, frequently asking Dr. Gerard questions when he was around, or making sure that the nurse passed her inquiries on to Dr. Gerard. She wanted more than anything to be seen as a very competent mother. Dr. Gerard visited her daily, and she always thought that he looked at her strangely, as if he were looking directly through her, or looking at something deep inside of her. And even though she didn't know what it was, she was determined that he would not see it, but instead would see what a good mother she was being, and how attentive she was to the baby, and how she was always doing the right thing. She didn't feel the fear at all, the fear that was always lurking just beneath her thoughts. But there was also another feeling. Joy was deeply angry that Dr. Gerard didn't trust her, didn't realize that she knew how to take care of a baby, that she was a good mother. How could he doubt her? Had she not taken good care of her little brother, even though he was such a difficult child, always wanting something, demanding that Joy do things for him, and scolding or being angry when she didn't know immediately what it was he wanted done? Whenever she thought of her little brother, she would soon begin to shake in agitation. A sense of dread and nervousness would overtake her, and she would find herself strangely furious, but without knowing why. And that was when she would find herself most angry at Dr. Gerard, finding things about him that she didn't like, criticizing his lack of awareness and his superior attitude. Just because he was a doctor, he thought he knew everything. Well, she would show him. He would see that she was such a special mother that he would have to apologize to her for having doubted her. Joy would triumph. Just after a few days in the hospital, Joy felt that she was surely ready to go home with her new baby. But one morning, the new baby began vomiting. Joy felt the baby was just throwing up a bit as it was being burped, and quickly cleaned it up before any of the nurses could see it. Baby began crying, and Joy tried to keep it quiet. They should all know that she can take care of a baby just fine. And so Joy rocked the baby in her arms and sang softly, "Hush, little baby, don't you cry." Baby would be quiet for a few moments, but then began crying again. Joy tried to nurse baby, but baby kept spitting the nipple out and continued crying. Joy began to get exasperated with such a naughty baby and rocked more and more forcefully. Just then a nurse appeared and asked Joy if she were having trouble. "No, certainly not. Can't you see I know exactly how to take care of a baby?" Nurse very gently asked if she could hold the baby for a moment, and Joy reluctantly gave it up. Nurse looked closely at the baby, and baby just then threw up again. The nurse called frantically for Dr. Gerard, who happened to be on call at that time, and his friendly face appeared at the door. "What is it, nurse? Is everything okay?" Joy was horrified. She felt she was being judged and condemned, and that they would think that she was an incapable mother and take the baby away from her. "Please, doctor, everything's fine. Baby's just burping up some milk. I just fed the baby." Dr. Gerard entered the room and looked closely at the baby. Curdled milk was streaming out of the baby's mouth and nose. He took it suddenly and rushed out of the room without saying a word. The morning quickly turned into a nightmare. The nurse followed Dr. Gerard out of the room without a word. Joy was sure that they would take her baby away from her, and she would never see it again. All she could hear herself saying was, "No, no, no." The terror had returned. Chapter 11, Involvulus. Much later, looking back at it, something that was impossible to do without crying and feeling deep shame, Joy's mind was always a jumble, and the thought, what could I have done differently, pounded away inside her head, insisting on an answer. Ted would try to calm her. He felt so completely helpless. Whatever he suggested or tried, she would negate, saying, No, it should never have happened. What did I not do that I should have? The loss was certainly his as well, and it was deeply felt and resented. But his view was, thank God I wasn't there. They would surely have blamed me if I had been. The event listed in Dr. Gerard's notes said simply, volvulus. But what is a volvulus? Ted later learned to look it up in a medical book, even though Dr. Gerard had explained it to him at the time. A volvulus was a twist or crimp in the intestine so that no food can pass. The more the baby eats, the more severe the blockage. Exactly that activity that should be life-sustaining becomes the very thing that results in the baby's death. Food accumulates at the point just before the blockage until the pressure is so great that not even blood can pass. The baby's organs are so fine and tender at this point that the cells begin to die and a necrosis sets in. That is, the intestine begins to die. Emergency surgery could be performed, but there is seldom much hope for the baby, since its membranes are so fine, and recovery depends on how long the tissue has been under stress. But in baby's case, there was no hope. It was no one's fault. But still, Joy insisted that there was certainly something she could or should have done. So she held herself fully responsible for baby's death. Chapter 12, The Letter. The days turned into months, the months turned into years. Very little transpired between Ted and Joy. He even began to think, what a strange name, Joy. She's never joyful. If anything, there's only sorrow and blame. Joy has no room for joy. Joy went through her day in sorrowful silence, doing housework, cooking, and always lamenting. The silences between them grew longer, and words fewer. The times of touching and being close, practically non-existent. And then one day, several years after baby's death, Joy received a letter in the mail. She was puzzled at first. Who would write to her? She didn't recognize the handwriting on the envelope. She had not heard from her family in years. They were very present with her when baby died, but Joy had been so unresponsive to their presence and to their communications that little by little they had stopped calling and writing. Her family had misinterpreted Joy's aloofness as a feeling that she was better than them, that she looked down on them and felt superior, and in their sharing this with one another, each became convinced that they were all being dismissed by Joy, and so they in turn dismissed her. There had been no actual contact now for many years. So the letter puzzled Joy, and even before she opened it, she began to reminisce about her brother and her two older sisters. Curiously, her first thought about them was that her brother had died and that her sisters were writing to inform her. And she heard herself gasp, "Oh, no." But she quickly hid her shock. Hid it because there was a very thin layer of pleasure at the thought. And this is what shocked her. It was not the possibility that he had died that stood out, but the sense of, yes, good that he's finally dead. She could not allow such a thought to be a part of her. These two contradictory thoughts were so fleeting that they were quickly buried. There was absolutely no room in Joy for bad thoughts or for conflict about them. She forced her own thinking to be simple and fully acceptable by others. After all, what would people think? So with a great sense of dread of the unknown content of the letter, she opened it with trembling fingers. Her hands were shaking so that at first she couldn't read it. So she quickly put it on the table and then looked at it. but the tears were so thick in her eyes that she could not focus on it. Ted just watched in amazement, wanting to ask questions but not daring to. The energy was so thick and controlled. Dear Joy, the letter began. We have been out of touch for so many years, and I have no phone number for you. I'm hoping you're still at the same address, for I don't know how else to get in touch with you. I'm sorry to be the bringer of sad news, but I don't know how else to begin. Our father passed away after a long illness. We didn't know how ill he was until he suddenly took a turn for the worse, and then it was suddenly all over. We thought initially it was just a case of indigestion, and he took one remedy after another. You know how he was. He never fully trusted doctors, and he resisted going to see a specialist. Everyone always expected him to get better, and it was several years before he took to his bed, refused to get up, and within a few days he was gone. The doctors now say he had cancer of the lower intestine that suddenly metastasized and quickly spread to his other internal organs. The saddest thing was that he really did not prepare to go, having always thought that whatever he had was a case of indigestion. So we were all shocked that he was suddenly gone. Mother was especially disturbed by his death, more than anyone had expected. At first, she refused to acknowledge that he had died, and kept insisting that he would suddenly recover. And this was even after the funeral arrangements were full underway. We thought she would recover, but she kept insisting that he was away and would soon return from his trip. Then she became deeply angry at him for not returning, and swore she was not going to put up with his nonsense any longer. She packed his clothes in suitcases and put them out on the lawn, claiming that he would have to find some place else to live, and saying that she should never have put up with it in the first place. We sensed that something was going on that we had never known about, and that it now was coming to the surface, but we didn't know what it was. She kept saying that she should have divorced him long ago when it first began. We didn't understand how deeply disturbed she was until early one morning she took a hammer to the car and began breaking all the windows. The neighbors called the police, and they came and handcuffed her. She was enraged, saying it was all his fault. I should have left him the minute it began, and tried to assault the officers. She was eventually sedated and taken to a hospital, where she is at present, although proceedings are underway to have her admitted to the state hospital for the mentally disturbed. Elena and I don't know what to do, and as usual, Daniel is no help at all. In fact, Daniel's attitude about Mother is very much like hers about Father, refusing to recognize that there is a problem and convinced that she will soon snap out of it. Elena and I are beginning to realize that there was always a dimension of denial in the family. We realized we had not seen it because she and I were so close, and we relied on one another rather than on the family. But at this point, we're beginning to recognize that perhaps we didn't really want to see what was going on, and that is why we developed such a close reliance on each other. We're sorry to trouble you with this family drama, and both hope that in spite of not having heard from you in many years, you are doing well in your own life. Your caring sister, Maria.